What we've been talking about so far in the course are human universals, what everybody shares. So we've been talking about language, about rationality, about perception, about the emotions, about universals of development, and we've been talking about what people share. But honestly, what a lot of us are very interested in is why we're different, and the nature of these differences and the explanation for them. And that's what we'll turn to today. So first we'll discuss how are people different, different theories about what makes you different in a psychological way from the person sitting next to you, and then we'll review different theories about why people are different. And this is the class which is going to bother the most people. It's not dualism. It's not evolution. It's this. Because the scientific findings on human psychological differences are to many of us shocking and unbelievable. And I will just try to persuade you to take them seriously. Okay, so how are people different? Well, there's all sorts of ways. Your sexual identity. It is at the core of your being, for almost all of us, whether you're male or female. How we refer to you in language, what pronoun we use, is indexed on how we whether you're male or female. And related to that, though imperfectly, is your sexual orientation, who you're attracted to. The question of why some of us think of ourselves as males and others as females, and the question of why some of us would ideally want to have sex with males, others with females, others with both, and then a few others who have harder to define desires, is such a good question that we're going to talk about it after spring break. While all the sexual desire has been spent and you could focus on a scientific discussion of this. Not that I recommend you do that on spring break. How happy are you? This is also such a good topic, it's going to get its own class. The very last class of the semester is devoted to happiness. And the question of what makes people happy, what makes people unhappy, and what makes people differ in their happiness. If I asked you to rank how happy you are from a scale of 1 to 10, the numbers would differ across this room. And there's different theories as to why. Your success and failure in life. This is somewhat interesting because you could study this in more or less objective ways. We don't have to ask people. We could look at your relationships, how they begin, how they end, your job satisfaction. We could look at your criminal records. Some of you are going to see time. Most will not. Some of you will get into little troubles all through your life. Some of you already have seen the inside of a police station, possibly a lineup. Others couldn't go near such a thing. What determines that? And at the root of all human differences are two main factors. And so I want to talk about the two main interesting factors. One is personality, the other is intelligence. And these are the differences I'll talk about today. First, from the standpoint of how do we characterize them, how do we explain them, and then from the standpoint of why these differences exist in the first place. One way to characterize personality is in terms of people's style in dealing with the world, and particularly their style in dealing with other people. So you take a simple character you know of, and you could talk about that person's personality. You could talk about it in terms of being impulsive, irresponsible, sometimes lazy, good-hearted. You could compare that person's personality with other people's personality, such as my colleague who gave a talk last class. He's wonderful. He's responsible and reliable and very kind. And different from Homer. And so this difference is a difference in personality. Now, when we talk about personality, we're talking about something else as well. We're talking about a stable trait across situations and time. So if all of a sudden the person next to you kind of smacks you in the head, you might be angry. But we wouldn't call that personality, because that's something that's the result of a situation. We'd all feel that way in that situation. It's personality if you walk around all the time angry. There'd be a stable trait. It'd be something you carry around with you. And that's what we mean by personality. Now, how do we scientifically characterize differences in personality? And it's a deep question. There's been a lot of attempts to do so. Any good assessment has to satisfy two conditions. And these are terms which are going to show up all over psychological research, but it's particularly relevant for this sort of measure. One is reliability. Reliability means there is not measurement error. And one crude way to think about reliability is a test is reliable if you test the same person at different times and you get the same result. My bathroom scale is reliable if whenever I stand on it, it gives me more or less the same number. It's not reliable if it's off by 10 pounds in the course of a day. Similarly, if I give you a personality test now and it says that you're anxious and defensive, and then give it to you tomorrow and it says you're calm and open-minded, it's not a reliable test. So reliable is something you could trust over time. Validity is something different. Validity is that your test measures what it's supposed to measure. So validity means it's sort of a good test. Forget about how reliable it is. Does it tap what you're interested in? So for example, suppose I determined your intelligence by the date of your birth. I figure out what day you're born, and I have a theory that from that predicts how smart you are. That's my intelligence test, the date of your birth. Maybe people born in January are the dumbest, people born in December are the smartest. Is that, I was born on Christmas Eve, is that a reliable test? Yes, it's a wonderfully reliable test. I'll test you today, I'll test you tomorrow, I'll test you next year, I'll test you the day you die, I'll get the same IQ score. Is it a valid test? It's a joke. It's absolutely not a valid test. It has nothing to do with intelligence. But you notice these are two different things. Something can be reliable but not valid, and something can be valid and not reliable. Now, there are no shortage of personality tests. You can get them all over the place, including on the web. So I took one recently. I took which superhero are you? And it's a series of questions determining what superhero you are. You could take this yourself if you want to. The same web page, by the way, offers you a test in whether you're hot or not. We'll discuss that later. And when I did this, it told me I was Batman. And you are dark, love gadgets, and have vowed to help the innocent not suffer the pain you have endured. Now, to be honest, though, it's neither reliable nor valid. When I first did the test, I came up as the Incredible Hulk. I then changed my answers a bit and was Wonder Woman. And finally, out of frustration, I carefully tailored my answers so I would be Batman. But the fact that I can do that, well, raises questions about both the reliability of this measure and its validity. Here's an example, a real-world example. This is, in black and white form, a version of the Rorschach test, the Rorschach ink blot test. How many people have heard of the Rorschach test? Okay. Is there anybody here who's actually, in any sort of situation, taken a Rorschach test? Some people scattered in the room have taken them. It was originally used only for psychiatric cases, but then became extremely common. About 80% of clinical psychologists claim to use it, and most graduate programs in American Psychological Association who are accredited teach it. Catholic seminaries use it for people who want to join the seminary. It was invented by a guy named Herman Rorschach. He devoted his entire life to the ink blot test. His nickname when he was a teenager, I am not kidding you, was ink blot. And the idea is, by looking at these ink blots and then seeing what somebody says, you get great insights into the nature of their personality, into what they are. Anybody want to try? Come on. Yes, what do you see?
I see two people holding hands
Two people holding hands pressed together. Very good. Anybody have a different reading? Yes, in back. Yes. Yes. Dancing bears. Okay, good. Good. Okay, I got to write your name down. Report you to health service. No, that's dancing bears. Dancing bears, very good. Anybody else? One other. Yes. A man in a ski mask. Well, it turns out that there are right answers and wrong answers to the Rorschach test. According to the test, and this is from a real Rorschach test, it is important to see the blot as two human figures, usually females or clowns. Good work over there. If you don't, it's seen as a sign that you have problems relating to people. If you want to go for cave entrance or butterfly or vagina, that's also okay. Now, the Rorschach test is transcendently useless. It has been studied and explored, and it is as useless as throwing dice. It is as useless as tea leaves. Nonetheless, people love it, and it's used all over the place. It is used, for example, in child custody cases. If you have broken up with your partner and you guys are quarreling over who gets to keep the kids, you might find yourself in a shrink's office looking at this. And in fact, this is why they end up on the web. There are services, there are people who have been kind enough to put on the web these ink blots, including the right answers to them. But they are worthless as psychological measures. Can we do better? Well, we probably can. Gordon Alport did a study where he went through the dictionary and took all of the traits that he believed to be related to personality. And he got 18,000 of them. But what was interesting was they weren't necessarily independent traits. So the traits like friendly, sociable, welcoming, warm-hearted seem to all tap the same thing. So Cattell and many others tried to narrow it down, tried to ask the question, in how many ways are people's personalities different from one another? How many parameters of difference do you need? How many numbers can I give you that would narrow you in and say what personality you are? One approach was from Eysenck, who claimed there were just two. You could be somewhere on a scale of introverted, extroverted, and somewhere on the scale of neurotic and stable. And since there's basically two types of traits with two settings for each, there are basically four types of people. Later on, he added another trait which he described as psychoticism versus non-psychoticism, but crudely meant whether you're aggressive or empathetic. And then you have three traits with two settings each, giving you 8 types of people. Later on, Cattell dropped it down into 16 factors. So these 16 personality factors are 16 ways people would differ. And so if I ask you to describe your roommate along these 16 dimensions, you should be able to do so. More recently, people have come to the conclusion that 2 or 3 is too few, but 16 might be too many. And there's a psychological consensus on what's been known as the Big Five. And the Big Five personality factors are these. And what this means is when we talk about each other and use adjectives, the claim is we could do so in thousands of different ways, but deep down we're talking about one of these 5 dimensions. This means that when a psychological test measures something about somebody, about their personality, if it's a good test, it's measuring one of these 5 things. And it means that as people interacting with one another in the world, these are the 5 things that we're interested in. So one of them is neurotic versus stable. Is somebody sort of nutty and worrying, or are they calm? Extrovert versus introvert. Open to experience versus closed to experience. Agreeable, which is courteous, friendly, versus non-agreeable, rude, selfish. and conscientious versus not conscientious, careful versus careless, reliable versus undependable. A good way to think about these things is in terms of the word ocean, O-C-E-A-N. The first letter captures openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And the claim is those are the 4 to 5 fundamental ways in which people differ from one another. Well, why should we believe this? Why should we take this theory seriously? Well, there's actually some evidence for it. It seems to have some reliability in that it's stable over time. So if you test people over years, if I test your personality now on the 5 traits and test you 5 years from now, it will not have changed much. And once you pass the age of 30, it's very stable indeed. If you think about your parents and then give mom and dad a mental test on where they stand on each of the 5 traits, 10 years from now, mom and dad will still be there. It also seems to get agreement across multiple observers. So if I ask for each of the 5 traits, if I ask your roommate what he or she thinks of you, then I ask your professor what he or she thinks of you, and your mom what she thinks of you, how would, back to gender, how would they match up? They tend to overlap a lot. You walk around and you leave, and your personality leaves a trail in the minds of people around you. And this trail is characterized in terms of these 5 dimensions. Finally, it seems to predict real-world behavior. If this didn't have anything to do with the real world, you wouldn't be very happy calling it valid. You wouldn't take it seriously as a test. But it does. So conscientiousness, how you score on a conscientiousness scale, relates to how faithful you are to your spouse. How open you are on the psychological personality test relates to how likely you are to change your job. Extroverts look people in the eye more and have more sexual partners because they're extroverts. So these are real scales. The Batman, Hulk, Wonder Woman doesn't correspond to anything in the real world. But where you stand in each of these 5 dimensions does seem to capture it. As an example of the agreement, by the way, somebody did a study of several of the characters on the television show The Simpsons, because they wanted to find characters which everybody knew. And they had 13 subjects judge these Simpson characters on each of the 5 dimensions. These is openness, neuroticism, conscientiousness, and extroversion. They found considerable agreement. And this isn't actually, what I've covered up is the agreeableness. So for those of you who've never seen the television show, this is all going to be confusing. But those of you who have, can you guess which characters would be particularly agreeable? Anybody guess? Yeah. Flanders? You are right. The most agreeable people are Flanders and Marge. Who would be not so agreeable? Krusty is a complicated case. But Mr. Burns, but also, where is he? Oh, he's not. Nelson. Where's Nelson? Anyway, there's Nelson. You get strong consensus that Ned Flanders and Marge Simpson are highly agreeable people, 6.27 and 5.46, while Mr. Burns and Nelson are very low. Nelson's the little kid, and when trouble happens, he goes, ha ha, and that's a psychological sign for low agreeability. Okay, that's all I want to say at this point about personality and how we measure it. And again, we're going to get back to it later when we talk about differences in personality. Now I want to deal with the second big difference. The second big difference is intelligence. Now, how do you define intelligence? There's no easy definition. Like personality, it's kind of difficult to get your fingers on what we're talking about here. In one survey, they asked 1,000 experts to define intelligence. And some answers showed up over and over again. So just about everybody said intelligence involves abstract reasoning, problem solving, and the capacity to acquire knowledge. That's at the core of being smart. Other people mentioned things like memory, mental speed, language, math, mental speed again, knowledge, and creativity, also as hallmarks for intelligence. And again, it might be difficult to define it, but you have a gut feeling about what it is. So, you know, Homer is actually, and this is part of the show, is actually of limited intelligence. My colleague is a very high intelligence, wonderful fellow. But he's probably not as smart as that guy, who's like really, really smart. And this guy, Ralph Wiggum, is particularly stupid. And so you have a range, and it's important to figure out how to characterize it. This is what research does. But there's a gut feeling that there's some people who are smart, and other people who are very smart, and some people who are dumb, and others who are very dumb. What you want to do from a scientific standpoint is characterize this in a more robust and interesting fashion. And the textbook has a nice review of the history of attempts to define and measure intelligence. But there's just a couple of ideas I want to focus on. One is an idea developed by Spearman, which is there's two types of intelligence. There's G and there's S. S is your ability on specific tests. So if there's 10 tests that you're given as part of an IQ test, 10 subtests, you'll get a different score in each of the subtests. There'll be a math test and a reading test and a spatial test, and you'll get different scores. G refers to a general intelligence, and the general intelligence is something you bring to each of the tests in common. So this is diagrammed here. You have these 6 tests. For each of them there is an S, and then above that there is a G. Now, G is a very important notion. The term G is used by psychologists a lot, even in casual conversation. You know, people say, so what do you think of him? And he has high G. And what you mean is, he's a smart guy. Why do you need G? Well, you wouldn't need G if your performance on each of these tests had nothing to do with each other. If the tests were genuinely separate, there'd be no general intelligence. But what people find over and over again is that when it comes to explaining people's performance on multiple intellectual tasks, there's two things going on. There's how good they are on a specific task, but then there's also a sort of general correlation that people bring to the tasks. And I could express this with an athletic analogy. Imagine I'm running a gym, and we have all of these different athletic tests. So we have a running test. We have a basketball shooting test, a swimming test, fencing, list of 10 of them. Now each of you go through each of the tests, and then you'll each get 10 scores. But what we'll discover is that the scores are not independent of one another. People who are good at one athletic thing tend to be good at another. If there's somebody who's really good at running and swimming, odds are they're probably pretty good at climbing. And the same thing holds for IQ, which is above and beyond how good people are at specific things, there seems to be a factor as to how well they are in general. And this factor is known as G. Now, there's, again, an extensive history of modern intelligence tests. And what's really interesting is the tests now, what you need to know about the modern tests, the Wechsler tests for both adults and children, is how they're scored. The way they're scored is that 100 is average. So it's just automatic. Whatever the average is 100. It's as if I did the midterm, graded the midterm, computed the average, gave everybody who got the average 100, said your score is 100. It's just the average. It works on a normal curve. And what this means is that it works so that the majority, 68%, get between 85 and 115 on their IQ tests. The vast majority, 95%, get between 70 and 130. If are, say, above 145 IQ, which I imagine some people in the room are, you belong to 0.13% of the population. That's the way IQ tests work. Now, this is about IQ tests. We could now ask about their reliability and their validity. What do they mean? Well, this has turned out to be a matter of extreme debate. This just reiterates what I just said. A lot of the debate was spawned by the book by Herrnstein and Murray called The Bell Curve. And in The Bell Curve, these authors made the argument that IQ matters immensely for everyday life, and that people's status in society, like how rich they are and how successful they are, follows from their IQ as measured in standard IQ tests. Now, this book made a lot of claims, and it's probably before many of your time, but spawned huge controversy. And as a result of this controversy, some interesting papers came out. One response to the Herrnstein and Murray book was by the American Psychological Association, which put together a group of 50 leading researchers in intelligence to write a report on what they thought about intelligence, what they thought about, does IQ matter, how does IQ relate to intelligence, how does, what's the different, why are people different in intelligence, why do different human groups differ in intelligence, and so on. At the same time, there was also another group of IQ researchers, not quite the same as the first group, got together and wrote another report. And if you're interested in this, the links to the reports are on the PowerPoint slide. Well, what did they conclude? The conclusions were slightly different, but here's the broad consensus by the experts. Regarding the importance of IQ tests. And the claim is IQ is strongly related, probably more so than any other single measurable human trait, to many important educational, occupational, economic, and social outcomes. In some cases, the correlation is very strong, such as success in school and success in military training. In other cases, it's moderate but robust, such as social competence. And in other cases, it's smaller but consistent, law-abidingness. And they conclude whatever IQ tests measure, it is of great practical and social importance. So IQ matters. More particularly, IQ matters for social achievement, for prestigious positions, and for on-the-job performance and other work-related variables. If I know your IQ score, I know something about you that matters. It's not irrelevant. Just as if I know your score on a personality test at a Big Five, I would know something about you that actually would tell me something interesting about you in the real world. On the other hand, there's a lot of controversy about why this connection exists. So to some extent, people have worried that the effectiveness of IQ is a self-fulfilling prophecy. And here's why. If society takes IQ tests seriously, they become important. So it's true that your IQ is very related to your success in getting into a good school, like Yale. But the reason for this, in large extent, is because to get to Yale, they give you an IQ test, the SAT. So, same for graduate school. There's a GRE, which is yet another IQ test. So to some extent, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Society could choose to make how tall you are extremely important for educational success. They could say, nobody under 6 feet tall gets into Yale.